Hi, this is Eli Ocheltree of the SnoKing Beekeepers Association. This is our third Wednesday monthly meeting in August. It's the day before we run our 11-day booth at the Evergreen State Fair, but we have to think about winterization while our minds are still partly in summer. Luckily, the weather has turned, and that has forced a lot of us to suddenly say, oh, do my bees have enough stores? Are these hives going to get any larger if the weather stays like it is? If you're overcast, rainy, the thunderstorms were really interesting. Okay, so we will get started on a presentation. I'll kind of go for about 45 minutes, and you can interrupt me, but we'll kind of record this first part. Some of you have heard it before. For some of you, it's just review. For some of you, it's the pep talk. We're going to get out there and get started on this and not put off, because this looks like it's going to be a traditional, what I think of as a traditional Puget Sound fall, where it could start raining anytime after Labor Day and stay rainy with some breaks for about 6 months is possible. And sometimes we get lucky and spring comes early in late February, March. But I look at winterization as we prepare for 6 months of rain. I wish it was 6 weeks. All right. And you can share. I think I set this up properly. Everyone can share screen pictures. And if you want to introduce yourself on the chat, that's fine. I will ignore the chat unless somebody flags me down and says, we can't hear you. The slides aren't advancing. Okay, do that. Do flag me down if I do that. So we're going to start with the general reminders, overview. If you're experienced, I hope you're still listening in, because you might be mentoring someone or you're going to get the questions. A large part of a presentation like this isn't to get all the information you need from a know-it-all like me. It's to get people talking. And once you talk, you come up with ideas. For example, treating for Varroa and monitoring to see that Varroa population drop. We know that the population zooms, even if we treated before. And it's actually would be interesting to do a whole talk on that. And there are some talks on the internet about why Varroa populations are zooming even higher than we can explain with just a normal, well, the bee population is dropping and the Varroa population is still there. So per 100 bees, there are going to be more mites. No, it's worse than that. And we know there's some other factors that are involved. It isn't just us. We're not crazy. The Varroa population really is exploding in relation to the number of bees we have in our hives at a faster rate than simple population dynamics of Varroa mites and bees explains. Want to remind people who do have mouse guards, do have mice problems. I worry more about rats closer to the city or where garbage is getting picked up on a regular basis. Rats and raccoons are bigger problems. But if your hives are out sort of in meadows and such, remember mice, voles, shrews, all those little critters, they're looking for a nice, snug, cozy winter home before it freezes. You can't wait to put your mouse guards on. If you have been having this kind of problem, and if you don't have uh, cats like I do, I have cats. Ha ha ha! I do not have rodents in my property, boy. I got cats, but I don't have rodents. But if you do, mouse guards go on before the freezing weather. And don't wait. Don't wait to do something about raccoons and bears as other sources of food sort of shrink up. And that's going to be happening pretty soon. People are bringing in their vegetables out of their vegetable gardens. They're starting to put tighter lids on the garbage cans. You may need straps around your hives, strapping your hives to your hive stands, cinder blocks on top. That will stop raccoons. Now, it's not going to help you with bears. Please don't ever think that straps will stop bears. But raccoons can be a big problem when a family of raccoons, and remember, her babies are teenagers now. So when they say a family of raccoons, this is like they are mosh pitting or whatever your hive. They can knock it over. and they can pry lids off, but just keep working at it and rocking it, and they can take over hives. The Varroa problem. Often people are treating for Varroa enough. You need to monitor. You did whatever it said for a basic round of treatment. You got to do the mite counts. Either alcohol wash, sugar roll, the slide the slide out board's not enough unless you know, absolutely know your hives, but enough is usually not enough, especially with that surge in population of varroa mites that we know is happening in this area. Last year, the interesting thing about last year, I kind of wanted to bring back because so many people sent me pictures and they had the picture of their hive dying out. And they said, the weird thing is, my queen is still there. When we lose hives over wintering, if you're like me, you go, lost the queen. There's no sign of her. And the rest of the bees gave up. They lost their focus. They just couldn't fight. But what was weird about last year was a lot of people were sending me pictures of a handful of bees around the queen, but they weren't enough bees for them to brood up. And they couldn't see anything clearly wrong with them. It just would, there were too few bees come February, March. And it's not like wasps or bumblebees where one female can go out and forage and, our queens can't do that. They lay eggs, emit pheromones, and hide from the beekeeper. They do not go out and forage and feed the babies and raise the larvae. They can't do it. They're actually very incomplete. They never develop to do all those duties. So if you don't have enough bees, it's a handful. You're down to half a frame of bees. A frame is pushing it, but half a frame, there's no hope, no matter how good your stores are. And people were finding they were in this situation. The queen was still there. All I can think of, anybody got some better theories, I would love to hear them. Was it the Varroa treatments were too late, too little? The bees were already damaged as larvae. They were, because they were fed on, their insides were sucked out of them by the Varroa, or as adults, again, fed on, or when the Varroa are feeding on the bees and they can inject the viruses directly in, did those viruses continue to prey on your bees and keep bringing the population down all winter? It was an odd phenomenon. I try really hard to listen, whatever, and I love hearing what people say, what's going on, because this was a pattern that was all I was hearing from everywhere. And these were people who had treated for Varroa, at least some, and they weren't inexperienced. They knew that what they were seeing was weird. Okay, for winter, you also going to have an insulation ventilation plan. And maybe you tried it something last year, something this year. My big warning on insulation ventilation plans is don't put on a whole bunch of insulation, rip it off, put it back on. I've heard people say that they're going to take off their insulation in the middle of the winter, or they're going to do radical changes on the ventilation in the middle of the winter, late in the year, early in the year. And why do fast changes? Do little ones, see if it makes a difference, do a little bit more. But the idea of taking all the insulation off or radically changing the ventilation worries me because our bees have brood nest almost all of the year. Now, a cluster of adult bees around the queen, they can move if they have to. It warms up a little, they kind of rearrange, and they can kind of shift over closer to the stores, up closer to the stores. They can do something like that. Once they have brood, and they have brood, as far as I can figure, almost the entire winter in this area, unless you're really high elevation, I mean, you might be different. But if you're in the lowlands, and even I'm at 400 feet and a little bit breezy, if you're there and there is brood, if you do sudden insulation changes, the cluster may have to come in tight because the temperature dropped because you took the insulation off. If that happens, some of the brood that they were covering and heating and taking care of may not get covered. You may be stressing your hive if you make radical changes a little at a time. I like to winterize in steps. I talk about 3 stages when I teach, and then reversing those 3 stages in the spring, not putting all the insulation or doing everything all at once and pulling it off all at once, and then not putting it on and off repeatedly. Because that brood nest is somewhat fixed. I mean, 21 days from egg to emergence for a worker, so that the bees cannot shift that. If it was too close to the cold outer walls and you take off the insulation, they can lose that brood. And that can be a big setback in late winter, early spring, when it wouldn't be a big setback in the middle of summer. 100 bees can be a lot bigger impact. 100 larvae lost, 100 pupae lost than it would be in the summer. So I ask people not to do quick disruptive things. Now, people get into moisture discussions all the time. I really don't think moisture is a problem. I think what we're really saying is we don't want water dripping on our bees in the middle of winter, particularly when they're in a cluster, and particularly when that cluster is trying to keep the brood warm. We always go for the KISS principle. Keep it simple, students. Dry, fed, treated, and I've added in do no harm. Those radical disruptive changes, anything too fast, too much. And every winter, if you're an experienced beekeeper, and if you're mentoring, okay, remember to keep repeating. Deep's worth of bees at the bottom. We're thinking kind of 10 frame deep, maybe a little more than an 8 frame, a few extra frames in addition to an 8 frame deep. And if you're talking horizontal, warre, top bar, think it through. A deep's worth of bees. And then a deep's worth of stores at the top if you're stacking. And feeding liquid as long as you can. Dry feed, people get into talking about dry feed at this time of the year. Dry feed is actually for emergencies. It's not the ideal feed, and there's a number of reasons that we can go into if someone wants to talk about it. It won't hurt your bees too much. Any feed is better than no feed. Treating for the varroa. Every fall, every winter we go through this. Insulated tops. I think most beekeepers are agreeing that insulation on the top to try to trap some of the heat that the bees generate that's rising. I think most small scale hobbyist beekeepers are agreeing on that, but you can open that up for discussion because there's always another opinion. If you're going to top vent, I do not, except sometimes in a very small period in late January, February, I get an awful lot of moisture toward the top of the hive. But even that has disappeared as I've stopped top venting. But small top vent, a lot of people, but large top vents, I think most people agree not doing a large amount of venting at the top. It's like chopping holes in somebody's attic or roof or ceiling. Solid bottom boards or slide out board in, not everyone agrees on that, but when people don't slide their might count slide out board in, if they have a screen bottom or change to a solid bottom board, when I listen to them, I hear them saying, well, I have no top vent at all. And I use a slotted bottom rack right on top of the screened bottom that I'm leaving open. So there's more and they're not in a high wind area. So there's not wind whistling underneath the hives. I hear something else. So if you do something that's different than what I'm talking about, different than maybe the standard, just make sure you tell people why you do it that way, because that made sense when somebody said, okay, I don't do it that way, but I have these other things I do. Any extra empty space in the hive when you start the winter is a problem for bees. Those mice we mentioned and little tiny shrews and voles that try to sneak in, and they try to sneak around the cluster, and they try to get down to where they can get into. Gotta turn my volume down, sorry. They sneak around and then maybe up or to the back of the hive. Okay. Extra space like that, yellow jackets, even smaller amounts of space. So extra space that you don't have to have empty in the hive, we recommend avoiding that and thinking now about getting rid of it. keeping at least a little bit of brood rearing until the really cold weather sets in. Pretty much, I think most people do this without even really thinking about it. You don't want to encourage a lot of brood rearing, but remember that fat bee thing that people, it's been really trendy. Everybody's been talking about the fat bees, and fat bees are just young bees that have never foraged. So what you want, what they're saying when they say make sure you get fat bees for the winter, they're saying make sure you have some young bees that are really well fed that never started foraging, because when they start foraging, they start the aging process. If you want your fat bee with a larger fat body system, if you want it to live for 4 or 5 months, possibly, depending on how cold our winter gets, if you want it to live that long, you don't want it to transition to forager. So you need to have some bees that are not too many weeks past emergence, because 3 weeks past emergence as an adult is generally considered the transition to forager. That can change a little with the season and such. But generally speaking, you're trying to get some bees emerging less than 3 weeks before you think your hive has stopped brood rearing in earnest. I think some of them, the queens will not stop and the workers won't stop, and there's small amounts of brood almost all of our winter. But you want at least some that when the freezing, sleety, sometimes here it's not freezing so much as sleety. Ugh, it's 40 and high 30s. It isn't quite freezing, but we want some bees that are young when that weather sets in. Knotweed. By now, I bet it's blooming all over. It was starting, people reported it starting in some of the lowland areas like 2 weeks ago. If the weather's good enough, the bees are going to enjoy it. That's part of what you're sometimes waiting to see, if the bees are going to get a good flow before you worry about that deep's worth of stores. I'm right now combining weak colonies. I was complaining, well, sharing that I'm the queen raising workshop apiary person. So at the malt bee apiary, when we took all of our overwintered hives and split those large hives into a lot of little nukes, when we did that, I did start the recording, didn't I? I was just wondering if I did. Good. I did start the recording. When we were taking those large overwintered hives and splitting them up and making mating nukes, and we ended up with about 25 at the peak point. All of those, when people take the queens home and adopt them, now we need to move them back, merge them back into larger hives. And there's not enough time for them all to grow out. I'm feeding 1-to-1 like crazy, which you might not want to do. The weather is starting to change. People could kind of share. It would be helpful if more experienced people shared. Where are you on this? Are you going to the 2-to-1 yet? I'm not, because I'm trying to get more comb drawn, and some of the young queens with smaller hives feeding 1-to-1. I'm even giving them pollen patty, anything they want. They are drawing out some comb for me, and I need more comb so that I can overwinter more bees with more stores. So that's where I'm at, but that's a little unusual. Once you stop hoping to get that comb drawn, and it is late in the year to get it, I'm only getting it because I have young queens, young small hives, and they are trying to brood up. So that's great. And I'll have more bees and I'll be able to overwinter more queens so that next spring I can take all those big overwintered hives apart again and make more mating nukes. It is a good time to think about requeening. I have one advantage in the craziness of doing the queen raising workshop. I find that I am replacing just about every queen every year. And there is a advantage to a queen that emerged after the summer solstice and is a young queen, and next spring is her first actual spring. So she's still considered a first spring queen next year. I really thought I saw it this year. I can see why commercial beekeepers will requeen half their hives every year. Like they do 50% one year and 50% the other year, so that queens never get more than 2 years old. Some actually even requeen every single year. They just go through and destroy all old queens, pinch them off, and requeen. Or when they do the splits, they make sure that they get rid of the old queen, sell the old one, move the old one on, and keep only the young ones. And feed if you think it might be needed in the dearth, but our dearth just turned into it rained. So now as soon as the weather's good, we may not have so much of a summer dearth as some years. Honey supers, a lot of you are pulling them off, but on the other hand, if the bees are starting to eat your honey, that can be, you have to decide, you're going to pull it off the honey supers now and feed them back sugar, starting to look for that deep's worth of honey and pollen, some pollen, but especially those carbs, those nectar honey stores. Getting the empty space down, I mentioned that. Moisture control. People think of it as moisture control. I think of it as condensation collection. I'm not trying to get the moisture out of the hive. I'm trying to make sure nothing drips on my bees, which is not the way everybody thinks of it. So that's a good conversation topic too. If your summer location was great for summer, but you know it's going to be bad for winter, you know the winds are going to come and you can't protect your bees, and the shade's going to be too much. They're going to be in full shade all winter. You may be relocating your hives. And this is a slide from my classes, and we always talk about how much do you need? And we just kind of give you that one deep's worth of honey in stores, and more experienced people sometimes make it through fine with less than that. But if you're a beginner, the tried and true, the most successful guarantee we can give you is a deep's worth of bees and a deep's worth of stores. And if you don't have that deep's worth of stores, which you often don't have your first year, you feed it to them and make them make it into funny honey. You want to feed them 2 to 1. So if your hive is big enough in population, the weather's turning, it may be time to do that, to start turning over. I'm looking to see if the weather does not pick up again, then I will be shifting to 2 to 1, because this looks like the early rain that comes and just settles in and pretty much stays through September, October. Could be wrong though. We could have good weather coming any day now, but I'm getting highs in the 60s. It's already going that low. And whatever you did last year may not work this year, because you may have a different queen. And without realizing it, your colony may have changed so much that the same system isn't going to work. The population curves. This simple population curve graph just doesn't totally explain. It sort of explains. Our bee population went up. We had the blackberry flow here. Hopefully it came down. Well, if you're a beginner, you couldn't get this high this fast. But your varroa population in either case was going up, and then the varroa population peaks as there are fewer bees for the varroa to feed on. And then we start really noticing them and really seeing the damage, maybe even seeing the deformed wing. And definitely when we do the alcohol washes, the sugar rolls, and the other method that I like of monitoring for mites, using oxalic acid vaporization, 2 doses in a row, 3 to 5 days apart, and watching the mite drop on your slide out board. There's a lot of systems that we can talk about. We've done this to have extra queens to overwinter. We've tried keeping some of the extra queens so we could build up faster in the spring by having queens right there, and we could get bigger brood nest. It was fairly successful, but it's kind of in some ways harder to gauge in how well they're doing. It's a little more difficult to unstack one side without disturbing the other side. But if you want to look at this, Michael Palmer does it. And I tried it, and it does kind of work. Okay, What kind of winter is it going to be? Okay, here's my favorite tools. You might as well go to the Farmer's Almanac and look at how big this, what do you call it? The woolies. We call these the woolly bear caterpillars. Okay, and then figure out by how big the band is in the middle, the red band, as opposed to the black bands, as do the weather worm. And I don't know if your kids ever came home from school with weather worms. And it says, I don't know if you can read it, it says, hanging outside. If I'm wet, you know it's raining. If I'm white, you know it's snowing. If I'm moving, you know it's windy. I mean, sometimes I feel like that's where we are on this. But they are saying a wetter, a La Nina, a colder, wetter. But I think Farmer's Almanac, somebody was saying warmer. So good luck. I recommend the weather worm personally. I have the pattern to make them if you'd like to try that. The fat bees. I was talking about fat bees. There's a lot of discussion about fat bees. Dawn Beck, Ask a Beekeeper, does a good talk on it, but she sort of doesn't say the part about you want bees, you want the brood rearing to stop as close to freezing as you can, actually. You actually want some well-raised fat bees that are very young and never go to forager. Because it's in foraging that bees really start aging. Kind of like becoming a parent. And suddenly you're, ugh, I don't have any energy left. I never get any sleep. I'm always stressed. Okay, no, sorry. My kids are all grown. I get to complain now. Though sometimes they come back and stress me anyway. But um, but it is, the foraging is where they really start to age. From then on, it's just how much can they do for the hive before they drop dead. And so there are a number of resources on this. A fat body, this is a picture of one. It's not just fat. It is a glycolipo protein called vitellogenin and some other molecules, and it's inside the abdomen of the bee. It's not just fat. It's much more important than that. But we don't have really time. That's a great discussion. But we are reminding ourselves that our bees can build up surplus stores during these long summer days. And that is why we can get honey production here in in Washington and the northern states. And that is how the tropical insect survives up here. It lays up these surplus stores, okay? And then that's the first mechanism. And then our little tropical bees turn around and cluster. They don't really sleep or hibernate, but they cluster. And because of that, they can reduce their consumption of honey. If you've taken my classes, you've already seen this, but I just think this is fascinating that a tropical insect could do this. And when they do this clustering, where they reduce how much energy, they're not maintaining a whole hive, they're just keeping them warm. They're keeping the queen at about room temperature, and they're keeping any brood that's there in the low 90s Fahrenheit. And they have a system, and the hive population has to go down over the winter. I hope you're entering with about 20,000 and you're coming out of the winter with, we hope, close to 10,000. That would be ideal, but less can make it. 5,000 would be enough. And it's not the cold that kills. That's the most important concept, is we have to tell ourselves that it's not the cold that kills. We can help our bees because the lowest survival temperature actually depends on the number of bees, the health of the colony when it went in, how parasitized by varroa, etc. was it? Does it have the stores? Where can you get to them? And how long does cold last without a warm-up period where the cluster could regroup? Not a good idea when we have sudden cold again in the spring, which I know happened to a lot of beekeepers. There were sudden drops in temperature in the spring. But getting through the winter, that's what bees need. They need to cluster, and that clustering does kind of expand and contract. They actually started on nights as cold as we're having now, nights that are going down into the 50s. They can move upwards, the cluster as a whole upward, if they don't have to stay with brood. They're trying to maintain contact with those stores of honey and pollen that we left for them. They're not trying to heat the whole inside of the hive. And I love this. If you notice, the black and white drawings are always from the Beekeeper's Handbook. They're up to 5th edition now. I highly recommend that book. You will need it at some point if you stay in beekeeping. And this is the thermometer picture out of it. When I put Samatero and Avatabile, that's Diane, I think it's Diane Samatero and Alphonse Avatabile. And this is general, but it gives you an idea of what bees need. And when you get down to these lower temperatures, at night times, for example, the bees have to sort of pull together. Each bee is cold-blooded, but the colony as a whole is warm-blooded. That's an incredible tropical insect adaptation to a northern climate. They can be warm-blooded when they work together. And then the brood rearing should be stopping at 50, should be stopping at 50. If it would get down there and stay there, maybe it would. Workers can't really fly at about that. The wasps and yellow jackets can, but the bees pretty much can't fly. And then there is a critical point where if they go outside of the hive and they fly out and it's too cold, they can't get back. They can't generate enough heat. About 42 degrees, it says here. They can maybe survive outside the hive and barely crawl back in the morning, but they cannot live by themselves. And I always like to put this slide in just so you're thinking about, we need a certain number of bees. This amount of bees is never going to stay warm enough. This amount of bees, okay. And this amount of bees, not every bee is in direct contact with the outside cold. And it makes a difference. There is less surface area to volume ratio is what this goes back to geometry. In case this brings back a headache just looking at it, it's because you did this problem in geometry, right? Anybody remember it? But it's important. If you get a certain number of bees, no longer here, every bee in a little cube that size would be generating heat like crazy just to stay alive. Here, not so bad. Some of them might get a break. And here, yeah, you could have some on the inside who don't have to generate nonstop heat. So think about what your issues are, what you have to fight against. And if you have having troubles with any of these, we can talk about it. People have good strategies. The cold alone doesn't kill. And we say that every winter. And then when bees die, you're trying to figure out what happened. A lot of times it was the colony was too small, weak. It could have been you started out and you were okay at this time of the year, but you didn't treat for varroa. So by the time we get to October, November, your population has been preyed on by varroa, or maybe you don't have the robbing screens on. The yellow jackets just overwhelmed me last year. I had to take small hives and dump them together. Those mating nukes that I have to try to build up in size, couldn't do it. I just had to, it was an emergency. I had so many yellow jackets, it was like clouds of them. I just had to shut down the entrances, but the colonies were so small. I took like 3, dumped them together, gave them some sugar spray to kind of get them to all agree to get along long enough that they could decide which one of the 3 queens they were going to accept. And I let the queens duke it out, and those colonies did make it through. 1 out of each of the 3. So, and mites, mites is just number 1. The summer mite, September mite count is the best predictor of winter survival. They have found that in studies, that that's when you know, is if you got your mites down. But a lot of us don't count, and we don't really get them down. So this year, absolutely everyone's resolution, right? And I already did that. And I was recommending winterizing in stages, not radical stuff all at once. I know it is so tempting. I'm going to do it all at once. I'm going to switch to 2 to 1, insulate the hives, put that cover on, and I'm going to be done in one day. But I really think sudden changes are not necessarily good for bees. So I recommend you kind of look at it as 3 stages. You're getting the empty space out. Reduce the number of boxes. Get those honey supers off if you don't think they're going to use them. If you're not intending to leave them for them to use, you're going to bank them. You're going to extract. Switch over to that telescoping lid. If you have not, and if you don't know, I don't know if I put a picture of migratory lid in here. A migratory lid is like a flat lid. It doesn't come down on all four sides. Peaked roofs work. They're usually telescoping on all sides. Telescoping means coming down over. The edges come down over the tops of the boxes. Top insulation, if you haven't had it on all year round, I put it on all year round. I figure my bees need the boost. Liquid feeder, if it's enclosed in stage 1, the liquid feed is warmed by the hive. So it can stay for longer when it's under an insulated top. It stays a little bit warm and the bees can pull the liquid down. Straps and weighted lids, don't wait until the raccoons decide to rock your hive. Robbing screens, the dearth that we just went through, you may already know you need them. And then this will be your last stage you undo at the end of the summer. This is stage 1 now. Oh dear. And then as it starts to go to freezing or kind of sleety freezing, 30s at night, maybe not quite freezing temperatures, a lot of people raise the back of the hive an inch, especially if a solid bottom board. And I slide the mite count, the slide out board in. The liquid feed, they're not going to be able to use, they'll stop taking it. That's how you know that your bees can't use it, is they stop taking it. So you take it out, and if you want to put some dry feed in there for insurance, or because you think they need it, you can put it directly on the frames or in some kind of a shim. Some people say it's a candy board or a Vivaldi board. And then the moisture and quilt box above the feed, so they can get to the feed, and then the condensation trap up right above that. And then the pollen, if you're going to do pollen sub 2, that also goes underneath where the bees can get to it, underneath the condensation trap. And either no top vent or a very small one. Then the last stage is really wrapping up and really reducing entrances down for most people. What works is what works. So I can't say that absolutely there's one true and only way, but generally speaking, reducing the entrances one way or another. Condensation control. We don't care if there's condensation inside the hive. The bees actually drink it off the walls. Seriously. You know the condensation you get on your tents? If you really tightly seal them up and you're camping with a bunch of people and you're all breathing out and sweating probably too, all that water, H2O, out into the air, and it collects on the sides of the tent and then it kind of trickles down the sides. Okay, the bees recycle that water. If you vent and let it out, some people do that too, but it's not actually necessary. It's just necessary to make sure that no water could drip right down on your bees. If it drips, you want it to be on the cooler outside walls, not right above on the inner cover or on the underside of the telescoping cover, then dripping down through the hole in the inner cover. You want something in between. And people call that a moisture shim. I really look at it as condensation trap. You're not trying to take moisture out of the center of the hive. You're trying to catch what drips down. Some people use a 1/8 inch screen to keep that stuff up in a shim or a shallow box like this. This is burlap. Some people staple burlap to do it. And that 1 inch tilting the hive by raising the back helps any rain or moisture run off the bottom board toward the entrance. It also means that if you tilt the whole hive, you've tilted your inner cover as well. So any moisture that did form there, some people get away with just doing tilting. I recommend insurance. I think top insulation is insurance. I think there's some of this that is duplicate protection. If you need to do something about wind and weather, and if you need ideas, there's lots of people in here that have ideas. There are people who do rain shelters. There are a carport. Anything with open sides is not going to be bad for your bees. It's going to be good for your bees. There are people who pick up their hives and put it under a carport, under a rain shelter, or move it to the lee side of a building instead of the windy side of the building. And the supplemental feed. Where do you make the change from liquid to dry? To me, it's easy. I just let the bees tell me. They stop taking it, take it out, give them the dry, only dry. Give them both, and whichever one they're eating is the one they want. Same in the spring. We had 2 really long, extended, warm, dry falls in a row. This one doesn't look like that. Anybody else see something different? I'm seeing what I consider the traditional Puget Sound in the greater Seattle area. I'm SnoKing. That's why the club is called SnoKing. I'm close to the Snohomish-King County line, but I'm at a little bit of an altitude, 476 feet. So I'm thinking this is going to be that foggy, overcast, drippy, rainy fall. Maybe not. And always remember that you can always be monitoring your hives by quick peeks and clearing the bottom entrances, taking the dead bees off, making sure you don't block what airflow you decided on. The dead bees right at the bottom, if you use a robbing screen, you're going to have to be careful to get the dead bees out more often, because sometimes there's a bunch of bees that die right after a frost. And some of the summer bees just go, give up the ghost. They just give up. Okay. And this is where people get into controversy. This is called a condensing hive. You accept a certain amount of condensation. You just put the moisture shim condensation trap here, and you don't let it go down here. You only let condensation form over here. If you make this warmer, if you don't leave this cold outer cover, but you put insulation here, the condensation won't form here. It'll form on the cooler sides. And that's the concept that on the right-hand side, Summa Terra Navitabili, the 5th edition of the Beekeeper's Handbook, is showing you. So you're going for the concept that works for you. And that's the stacking order kind of. Whatever you got on the bottom, bees and brood to the bottom, stores above, however the feed so they can get to it, and so you can quickly check it too. Then something maybe that absorbs any condensation that drips down, insulation, outer cover, and concrete blocks, straps, whatever you need. And I wrote it again, the stacking order here. If you think top down, okay, here it is again. There's the picture. Straps and weights. I need the top insulation. I want that condensation trapper. And if I'm going to have a vent, it's going to be up there. Then the feed, if I have any feed, sugar blocks, fondant. I've taken my liquid feed off probably. And this feeder will be called different things. It'll be called, some people just put the feed right on their inner cover, which to me makes sense. I don't buy $30 shims, but if it makes more sense to you to use something called a Vivaldi or a candy board or something, I just usually, if it has a solid floor, I just put it on my inner cover. Pollen. If you want the bees to be able to access the sugar or the pollen I find in December, early January, if you are thinking that they might be able to access it and get out of cluster long enough to use it, you need it to be under your solid floor, your inner cover, or if your candy board, Vivaldi board has a solid floor, it has to actually be under there for them to access it. Otherwise, they'll probably be fine. They'll have to come up and access it when it warms up just a little bit. I find that's the point, December and early January, where my bees cannot come up to the top of the inner cover, usually. And then they can after that. This is, I don't know if this is how interesting this is to beginners, but to more experienced beekeepers who know that the bees actually do pretty well in winters that are somewhat colder, but not all the way cold. This here, if you have time to study this, is sort of explaining why when bees inside the hive, when it is 50 degrees in their hive, inside the hive, not outside the hive, could be a lot colder than that, they are actually forming a cluster, and this 10 here represents, that's why I circled it here. 10 Celsius represents about 50 Fahrenheit. I wish they would just have some way for me to convert this graph in this table, but there isn't. So just think 50 degrees. Inside the hive, it can be a lot colder outside, but the cluster is concentrating on at 50 degrees inside the hive. They are concentrating at starting the clustering, and they are the most efficient, actually. The temperatures are colder than that outside. And you will see that your bees are using less stores in one winter than another. But their goal when they cluster is to put the queen goes to the center, and they keep her at about room temperature. If they have brood in there, they have to really pump out the energy, because brood, once they've started brood, if they can't let it die, and they should not let it die, that needs almost our body temperature, 92 to 94 degrees, even in the absolute worst, coldest part of the winter. You're probably figuring out how to do this. Let me skip that slide. There's a lot of shims and spacers, quilt boards and such. The only thing about the previous slide is I like when cutting down your deeps. If, like me, you work with deeps a while and you say, you've got to be kidding, I cannot lift a 10 frame deep. I'm tired of taking 5 frames out every time I want to lift this box. And you decide you're going to go totally to Westerns. If you decide that, taking 3 inches off the bottom of a Western gives you a 3-inch shim. And that 3-inch shim, if you put 1/8 inch on the bottom of it, put whatever your shredded material, your moisture absorbency, condensation trap stuff is, and then put a 2-inch piece of styrofoam right on top of that. If you lay this down, 1/8 inch shredded material, 2-inch styrofoam, and then put your outer cover, your telescoping cover on top, you have got a great winterization system. Or you can pay $35 a piece or something for these. I'm too cheap. Okay, I think that was pretty much, yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say. And I forgot to put a stop slide in there. So I talked way long. I hope it was only 45 minutes. Well, a little longer. Okay. Anybody else want to kind of say, okay, I do this, I don't do this, I substituted. This is your chance, okay? And you can ask questions on how to handle your problem, or how you handled it and now feel like a great success.
Hey, this is Diane in Kenmore. I have 2 new hives. I'm a new keeper this year. The hives had a slow start. At this point in time, they're just about complete their Varroa treatment. I did a Formic Pro. So I haven't gone in to inspect over the last couple of weeks, but at this point in time, I have 2 8-frame hives full on each. I have 1 deep 8-frame on each hive of brood. One of them was building out the second frame of comb and honey. The other one had not quite started that as of 20 days ago. So I don't know where they're at now, but I'm having a feeling that I am not going to have 8 frames worth of honey for either hive. So it sounds to me like potentially the best thing is going to be to combine the 2 so that I have enough honey. When do I make that decision? I mean, at what point in time do I physically do that?
It's kind of when you can't feed them any more liquid feed. Do you
Okay.
see them still drawing comb? Can you get that second one that's still drawing out the comb on the second box?
The first one definitely was. The second one, I had only just put on a box when I started the Formic Pro because it suggested to expand. So I don't know where they're at, honestly,
Yeah.
so maybe they may be a couple frames, but there's definitely not going to be eight frames.
Yeah, I'm wondering, if you feed like crazy, they might still draw out comb. That's
Okay,
the trick, is they've got to have something to put the honey in. It's not a problem to feed them 2 to 1 and have them start storing, because 2 to 1 they tend to store. But if you keep them on 1 to 1 for a while longer, the hope would be that they keep drawing out, um, honey. If the one gets really good at drawing out honey, and you get like 10 frames of honey drawn out, of comb drawn out there, if you can move some over to the other one, you can try to
right.
get both hives through that way.
Yeah, yeah.
I I don't know if I want to recommend anything. Anybody else got another idea? There's some double screens combining and stuff, but it gets tricky because you've got to be able to feed the one in the middle.
So I had not even realized until you said so earlier that when you're switching over to the 2 to 1, you're changing their thought process of stop drawing comb and start
A little, a little.
storing.
Some hives, a lot of hives will respond to the 1 to 1 as a nectar flow.
Okay,
And they will think of it as, okay, we have a flow coming in, we can raise brood, we can continue to expand. And then others go, oh, we can't continue to expand anymore when they see 2 to 1.
okay.
And they say, oh, we have to start packing this in. Not always. Every hive is a little bit individual. But if you can hang on with the 1 to 1, and if the weather warms up, did you get as low? I think I only got to the 60s today. If you're still getting 70s,
Yeah, it was like 70, 71 when I got home from work today.
okay, you're higher than me, and that can help a lot. Okay, trying to think. It won't let me go back. Tomorrow again, I'm only gonna, oh, it might get to 69 tomorrow, is what it's telling me. Um, if you can keep that going, and if they will pull out the comb, then you can stuff them full of 2 to 1 and pollen
Okay.
patty. And
All right.
actually, feeding them pollen patty now helps them concentrate on on building out the comb, because they
Okay.
don't
Yeah.
have to send anybody out to forage. The weather's so bad. I don't know. I'm getting overcast. Everybody else getting overcast too, and the
Yeah.
thunderstorms. Did your bees act weird? Matter of fact, somebody was asking me, uh, their bees all rushed out after the thunderstorm. I think the air was so clean. It wasn't that they couldn't take a cleansing flight before. It's like everything changed, and maybe that's why, but my bees did act differently after the thunderstorm.
Interesting. Interesting. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so
S-
no, that's some good thoughts. So I think I have a
Yeah.
better plan now.
Anybody else have good ideas here? It's time to speak up and help out Diane, because
Yeah, the pollen patty I had taken out because of the formic probe, but now that I'm done, I'll put a
you
pollen
know,
patty in.
the reason it says don't feed is they're afraid that the feed will just sit there and spoil and get, like pollen patties can get dry and crumbly. That's the reason why. It isn't that it's going to hurt them. It's
Hmm.
that if you just put the feed on, and I hope you're doing the half dose Formic Pro, are you?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Two 10
great.
days. But I ended up having to take a break between the two because we had that 3, 4 days of 80-degree weather, 80, 82.
Yeah.
Just didn't
And
want
the
to take a chance. So I just
first
stayed
three,
away.
4 days, that's the one you
Mhm.
worry about.
Right.
Yeah. And if the type of formic you have, if it says that's the top temperature is 80, 85, yeah, that was
I
smart.
just didn't
That
want
was
to take
smart to
a
pull
chance.
back.
There was no reason to, so
Yeah.
I just waited.
And
So
it didn't kill your brood, what you've done so far.
no, no, I
Good.
haven't seen
Okay. You've done
any
it
other.
wrong if all your brood's dead.
Yeah.
And then if all your brood is dead, sometimes your queen has been impacted too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm
Okay,
anxious
good.
to get
Sounds
in
good.
there and inspect this weekend.
Yeah. I'd rather do Apiguard in the fall if I'm not doing oxalic acid, because formic scares me. It can be strong. Yeah, and the weather can unpredictably go high.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks. That's good. Okay. That should get other people thinking.
Hello?
Oh, okay, Heather. Yeah. I'm not very good at watching the hand raised. That was good of you
Oh,
though.
I don't know. I just learned how to do that. I don't know if I
Okay.
can take it down. There it goes. Um, Okay, so this year for me has been experimenting like from the very beginning and with a lot of failure. Some success,
No,
my bees are still alive, but so that's good.
but
So
you zoomed through winter, right? Winter was just crazy good.
yeah, I mean they made it through the winter, great. I divided them and
Yeah.
bought queens, new queens. I requeened them in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
And I fed them like crazy, and they were enormous. All four hives, huge, robust.
Mm-hmm.
Their mite counts were low. They were doing awesome. And then, but I think I didn't time everything. I need to spend more time figuring that out this year. I didn't time everything right. So they were huge and robust and awesome. And then there was no blackberries. And I think they swarmed because it was just they were, and I couldn't stop it. Like I tried everything I in the arsenal that I could find to try to slow them down, and they
Me
didn't.
too.
And I
Me too. All
oh
my
you
all my swarm prevention methods sort of didn't quite work. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
oh man. So I
Because
think all four.
it went for 2 months. It didn't go for 2 or 3 weeks. It went for like 2 months of trying to suppress the growth.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I thought maybe so okay, for that problem, I was wondering specifically what you thought about just to complete that, and then I want to head back to that because I'm thinking of next spring, how I want to manage that. Um, so, okay, I've got no honey, basically, like tiny, tiny bit of honey. The hives, I lost one, so I've just three now. But they're robust and healthy and doing awesome. And I was really hoping that maybe I'd get some knotweed. So I'm doing an artificial break, and I caught all my queens, and so I can treat them for oxalic without putting something funky in there because I'm hoping to be able to harvest some honey. Um, so my thought is in the spring, instead of while I'm trying to, I think maybe, I don't know, maybe like after I divide the hives in the spring so they don't swarm, I do a brood break, um, somewhere in the process of building them up so that they don't get so massive before the blackberries. So my timing is a little better so they don't get all swarmy. I don't know if you can speak about that and just the timing,
Wow.
because I was thinking instead of Apivar this year, maybe I might try three brood breaks, like the natural one midwinter, and then two artificial ones, one in the fall and one in the spring for like 14, 15 days.
Okay,
There's
that's an
nothing
awful
wrong
lot.
with
You went through an
it.
awful lot. You don't know what next spring is going to be like.
Sorry.
It's going to be totally different. Okay, so
Yeah, yeah,
you were
yeah.
using Apivar still?
No, I haven't used Apivar since I did do a dose of Apivar early in the springtime, but
Did it
no,
work?
nothing else.
Did you monitor?
I mean, I did
It's been
also that.
failing.
Well, there was at some point, okay, so okay, there is a little bit of added something else too. So when the bees got huge and I'm like, no, don't swarm, and I go in there and I'm busting down all these cells like crazy. And then I
Mm-hmm.
think they had swarmed, and then I couldn't find my queens, and then I had no brood. So I'm like, oh heck, I got no brood. So I'm gonna go ahead and do a treatment. So might as well. There's no brood. So I did treat in the early summer because I had no brood. And then I ended up requeening. So I requeened twice this summer,
Oh, you
which was
bought queens?
expensive. I bought
Ooh,
queens a second time, yeah. And they're doing great. They're going
okay.
nuts, laying lots of eggs
Yeah.
now.
I bet they were superseding when you did the formix, so they couldn't because what happened was when I tried to suppress the swarms, doing all my methods, they were going to make cells anyway. So all the old queens disappeared. And the ones that I kept from swarming, the queens all disappeared, and younger they replaced with a younger queen. I couldn't keep up with the swarm cells. But if I was gonna do it again, I would just do flat out splits. I would not try to keep them that big. I would do splits and then reemerge. But who knew that a situation that was gonna last 2 or 3 weeks turned into 2 months? That you're
And
only
was that
supposed to
just
do
because
swarm
was the black,
management for a couple of weeks.
was it because the blackberries were late, or just because our spring was long with that hot spell in the middle, or what?
And they couldn't forage it predictably, and they got really confused. And yeah, I think they got really confused. I think pulling the cat brood off, thinking back, would you have done that and just made one split by pulling the cat brood off and putting it over to one side, take the congestion pressure off, and you'd still have all those bees if I was going to do it again, rather than checkerboarding, demarraying, and doing a lot of fancy stuff. I wish I had done that, but I was trying not to split. I was trying to get big brood nests so that I would be able to make good mating nukes later. Yeah.
Have you tried using a brood break during that time, just as a habit for treatment for mites, and then
It's
also to just slow them down in the spring?
I know brood breaks are used for a number of things, but they usually don't try doing a brood break in the spring. Have you read about that? I've heard about it being
No,
done on purpose during the blackberry flow, because actually, if you do a brood break during the blackberry flow, and you sequester the queen or you put her over in a nuke or something, and they're so busy doing the nectar they actually don't raise supersedure cells. And okay,
Mm.
some people have deliberately done or put her in an isolation chamber inside the hive, so she's still there. There's still some pheromones, but they don't let her just wander around and lay. Okay, that I've heard of, and it increases honey production. It's done in a lot of Europe. There's some great information out on that. But then brood breaks right before you're going to do a treatment. But formic acid in itself produces, for example, a brood break. A lot of people don't realize it. When it's done at full dose, it kills some of the larvae. So it introduces a brood break, maybe even though you're not thinking about it. And so
Mm.
some people, that's how they get their brood breaks. So we do them, but we don't do them. But it's a good thing to think about. I'm fascinated by it. Um, I really want to try it if I ever stop doing the queen raising workshop, which changes my whole schedule around to completely different than the way I used to keep bees. So how many other questions did you have? You had so many issues in there. I was going, oh my goodness, you're doing so much. You muted yourself. So I can't remember all the questions. That was so much you were trying. You're still muted, just in case you wanted to talk. Still muted.
I am. Hi.
Okay.
I'm I'm in Chelan, so it's kind of bad, a little weird.
So did we get
So the question was about the brood break in the spring. So you normally, like, that was just a thought, because I was trying to figure
most people
if it's
don't,
slow
because they will
treatment.
interpret it as something's wrong.
So the way that they were so swarmy this spring is because this was only my first year actually getting them through winter. So I don't have like
Hmm.
years of experience. So my thought was that maybe I just overfed them. I just grew them too big too fast.
But it would have been right had the blackberry flow not been rained on, had it not, you know, had it started on time instead of late. It should have started right at the beginning of June for most people, and some people
Mm-hmm.
before that, and some people I think it did start. There was quite a variation, but it was more like July this year.
Okay,
It
well
was
then.
weird. That was you were ready. It just yeah. I
Mhm.
kept thinking it's the weather's going to change any minute. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, me too. I was so close to getting it perfect. Anyone else that struggled with the holes? I'm trying to keep my bees from making all these swarm cells, but I don't want to shut them down because that blackberry flow is coming any minute.
a question on a different topic about moisture, if that's okay.
That's great. Yeah.
So I was thinking while you're talking about moisture traps versus moisture control, I've always, no matter what I've tried, had hives that have moisture issues, to the point where the bottom board is like soaking wet. Um, and interestingly, most of those hives have made it through winter. But I'm thinking about trying to put like the absorbent moisture board where like as the inner cover. So drilling a hole in the middle of it because my inner covers are normally what's soaking wet. And then that drips down through the hive.
Right. Right. And you don't want anything dripping onto the inner cover. You want your moisture control above that, and your condensation dripping
Yeah.
from above. You want it to hit that burlap sacks, shredded whatever, wood shavings,
Yeah.
wood
So
chips.
I've tried the wood shavings, I've tried moisture boards above like the dry sugar and my inner cover, and it never absorbs anything. So I'm thinking trying and putting a moisture board with a hole in it as my inner cover.
Well, wait a minute. Where's your upper venting? Are you doing too much upper venting then?
I've tried both having an upper vent. Um, so the upper vent would be above, like at the top of the inner cover between that floor and the moisture absorbent method.
Okay,
So
because
not in the hive itself, but up above it.
you're trying to, are you worried about having the bees have an escape route in case the bottom gets blocked or something?
No, that's just always how I've had my upper entrances.
Because if you put that where the cold air, where the air rushes out and there's a sudden temperature drop every night, because it's going to happen every time the temperature drops, warm air rises, it's going to go out that hole. And then coming back in, I should probably stop the recording because this is probably not something that